Hi there, we're looking at antagonistic pairs today using the GCSE PE AQA specification as our reference point. So the first thing you need to understand before we can start to look at where an agonist may be within an exam question is that we need to have an understanding of the location of muscles within the body, the major muscles, as part of those identified on the specification. So the first thing you need to do is make sure that you learn these muscles. Once we move from here, one of the big things that you'll see within some exam questions is it will talk about specific examples, often, let's say, the execution phase at certain joints. So here within the basketball layup, we're looking specifically at the ankle, but it's talking about the execution phase. So this is suggesting that we are going onto our toes. For context, a different example, the preparation phase in football would be whereby the ankle is coming towards the backside. The execution phase, by comparison, would be where we've got extension of the knee, and therefore we are actually striking the ball. So often you might see these phases, and being specific with your examples is very much recommended. So if we've got execution phase at the ankle, we know that there's plantar flexion, meaning that the agonist must be the gastrocnemius. Muscles work in pairs. So the muscle on the other side, the one that is relaxing in this case, is the tibialis anterior. In the same principle here, we're looking at the elbow during a throw-in. So we've got extension at the elbow. So therefore the agonist must be the tricep. And if the tricep is the one that's working, muscles work in pairs, the one that is relaxing, the antagonist is our bicep. Here we've got a whole body action, but it is an action at the hip, the execution phase at the hip. So in this case, we hopefully know that we have got hip flexion. So therefore, the hip flexors are our agonist, and therefore the gluteals are our antagonist. So key memory tool at this point is that muscles work in pairs and they only pull. In terms of muscle contractions, it is also important that we're able to understand the differences between isotonic and isometric. So let's look at isotonic first. We have two types of isotonic contraction. The first being isotonic concentric. So concentric is where the muscle shortens, it's contracting and shortening, and isotonic eccentric is where it contracts and lengthens. Most questions will ask you about isotonic concentric, but it is still important that we're able to provide some examples for isotonic eccentric. So the obvious examples for isotonic concentric: kicking a football with extension at the knee, press-ups on the upward phase. So we've got the tricep as our agonist. It is contracting and shortening. When we look at isotonic eccentric, typically this is the lowering phase. So lowering in a squat, lowering where you've been doing some pull-ups, a press up on the way down, so the recovery phase. So the agonist is still the same muscle as if it was isotonic concentric, but the big difference is that the muscle is relaxing. Okay, it is lengthening, even though it is working. Still contracting, even though it lengthens. Isometric, by comparison, this is an action where there's no movement. The muscle is working, but it is not changing length. Crucifix in gymnastics, so when you've got the rings and you're in that position, you are staying in that same position. You are therefore working isometrically. The muscles are working very hard, but there is no movement taking place. Some questions just to apply it. So using the photograph, there was two parts to this. I've just taken the most relevant part. Identify the main agonist, antagonistic pairs, at the knee and ankle. 2 marks, 1 for each. So we know that we should have, as we're driving out the blocks, we're going through the execution phase. So we should have extension at the knee, meaning that at the knee, it will be the quadricep. And if we've got extension at the block, we should be getting plantar flexion. So at the ankle, it should be the gastrocnemius. 2 easy marks. It didn't ask us for the antagonist this time, but if we know that the agonist here is the quadricep, the hamstring must be our antagonist. And if we've got the gastrocnemius as our agonist, the antagonist must be our tibialis anterior. Define. So the word define means AO1, a concentric contraction. That means isotonic concentric, using a sporting example. 1 mark for the definition, 1 mark for the example. So isotonic concentric contraction is where the muscle shortens. It is changing length and it shortens, and We can give many examples here, such as striking a football during the execution phase, where there is extension at the knee. Try and be really specific with your examples. Here, again, we've got a definition of isometric. So in this case, we know that the muscle does not change length, and give a sporting example. And that sporting example could be that crucifix or plank, for example. Okay, how it might look in a exam as well. So identify the main, so identify AO1, just give me the information, the main agonist at the knee in the downward phase. This is why we circle. So normally a question will make us go this way from A to B. This time we're looking at the kind of diagram going downwards rather than upwards. So really I should have drawn the arrow here saying normally it would ask you to go from A to B, i.e. we're going through an isotonic concentric contraction. This one's a little bit sneaky because it's asking for the agonist, but even so, either way, it's the same. It's the only difficulty, the reason it makes it tricky is it's an isotonic eccentric contraction. So the main agonist is the quadriceps. This is more like a question might look. Notice we've got 4 marks here. Explain. We're looking at AO2 predominantly. We're applying. Muscles and bones work together to produce movement. So as part of that, there's plenty you can discuss, and it's far simpler than you realise. Muscles are attached to bones via tendons. So if we talk about the insertion is attached to the moving bone. In this case, it's the radius, for example, if we use a bicep curl as our AO2 context. So I might say that muscles work in pairs and are attached to bones via tendons. The origin is attached to the stationary bone. The insertion is attached to the moving bone. In this case, it's to the radius. It goes across the elbow joint to allow movement to take place. Muscles are arranged in these pairs so that they can pull, and the agonist, in this case, the bicep, will contract because muscles can only pull, and the agonist, in this case, the tricep, will lengthen. Muscles occur across a joint. Give one static balance and explain how muscles work to maintain this balance. So give AO1 one static balance, an underlying balance, and explain how the muscles work to maintain this balance. So we've got 5 marks here. There'll be 1 mark for the balance and 4 marks for the explanation of how it maintains it. So for AO, it's really kind of both of them are AO2, if I'm honest. But if we're giving our first kind of identification, AO1/AO2, we've got an arabesque, for example, a gymnastics pose. You could say a plank. It doesn't specify a sport as such, so it's important in physical activities. It just says in a balance. Arguably, a plank is less of a balance, so therefore an arabesque would be a better example. So 1 mark for that. And then we need 4 marks from the muscles work in pairs. They work across a joint. Other muscles will fix the movement to make sure that it remains in a stationary position. Standing on 1 leg, for example, that feels like you're just describing what an arabesque is. But muscles work together to ensure that we are working isometrically. Plenty of marks available for that question. So to summarise, when we look at antagonistic pairs, we need to know where the muscles are firstly. We need to understand that muscles work in pairs and they can only pull. It is important that we know what the origin and the insertion is. Origin attached to the non-moving bone and insertion attached to the moving bone. And then just try to be really clear with your examples so that you are clear with regards to what phase the action is going through, and use terminology like extension at the knee as a football is being kicked, so that the examiner is very much clear which part of the action you're referring to. Thank you for listening.